seminar series. So we're starting this week with Nicola Kirkby, who is currently finishing her PhD at King's College London, and her PhD is on platform narratives, railway infrastructure and literature in the long 19th century. And here we are hearing a paper on the very end of that long 19th century on mental mobility in Howard's End.
Thank you so much. Published in 1910, E.M. Forster's novel Howard's End had a recurring role in critical discussions about mobility in fiction. In part, this has been driven by the novel's famous epigraph, "Only connect." Suggestive open-endedness here is catnip to literary critics. I don't want to dwell too much on the phrase, but to me, as prefaces go, this epigraph has a strikingly terminal effect. It offers a point of departure, an orientating perspective, and helps frame the narrative that follows. But it's also a conclusion or an end in itself. It casts a judgment on the text in retrospect. And in the railway imaginary, the terminus serves as both beginning and ending. Howard's End, whose title refers to a family home, sits near the Great Northern Railway line, and it has a fairly limited scope. For the most part, the novel moves between two families, exploring the relationship between the old money Schlegel sisters and the enterprising Wilcox family, during a period of financial and domestic uncertainty. Forster weaves a stance on mechanised transport into this relationship. The pro-motoring Wilcox family and pro-railway Schlegel family become champions of diverging attitudes towards a shifting transportscape in the 1900s. Through them, Forster ruminates on friction between the railway and the motor car at a historical moment when the cultural prominence of the former looked likely to be eclipsed by the popularity of the latter. For the purposes of this paper, the ins and outs of Howard's End's plot aren't that important, but I am interested in the broader questions that this novel raises about how mobility intersects with imaginative scope. Like Andrew Thacker in his chapter on Howard's End and the motor car in Moving Through Modernity, I'm going to explore the way that this text moves through some of the topographies that it proposes. Thacker argues that in Howard's End, quote, the car represents a sense of flux, disrupting an older idea of the genius loci, and pushes the novel, perhaps against its author's wishes, towards a more developed, modernist narrative. I agree that Howard's End explores friction between car culture and being in place, but I think the dichotomy that Thacker's proposed here between older ideas and modernist narrative needs some unpacking. The split between pro and anti-motor car stance is perhaps too pronounced. So rather than interrogating this claim in terms of retrospection and innovation, I want to re-examine it through the novel's use of railway infrastructure. Technological progress, which lent momentum to the turn of the century modernisation, caused delay as often as acceleration. The railways integrated scheduled stopping points, stations, junctions and termini, which punctuated journeys and helped reorient those travelling along the line. Connection and disconnection depend on specific material and temporal circumstances, on stasis and the ability to extrapolate from a moment as much as on onward momentum. So I'm approaching Howard's End as a 19th centuryist, really, one alert to the persistence of Victorian railway innovation in the 20th century. Car culture did not consign the railways to history, but Howard's End worries about that as a possibility. The novel provides suggestive reflection on what kind of mental mobility the railway imaginary can offer amidst other quite speedy, quite appealing options. This paper is structured around 3 examples of mental mobility in Howard's End, each with either an explicit or a latent link to railway infrastructure. So let's look at the first one. Before delving into Howard's End itself, I want to share an example with you of what happens when Forster tries to situate the house that inspired it in a much earlier piece of writing. Forster modelled the eponymous house in Howard's End on the Rook's Nest, a family home near Stevenage that he visited frequently as a child. Editor of Forster's collected works, Oliver Stallybrass, notes that, quote, so much has been acknowledged by Forster, but to realise the wealth of detail which Howard's End owes to Rook's Nest, it is necessary to read his account of the latter, written for the most part at the age of 15. Biographical interest aside, Forster's approach to narrating this space as an adolescent shares some suggestive similarities with his subsequent multiple attempts to introduce the house at Howard's End. On the Rook's Nest, Forster begins, I think I have quite a clear impression of my arrival at Rook's Nest. I certainly remember coming in the train asking the names of the stations as we passed, and pronouncing Welwyn as it is spelled, instead of calling it Welwyn in the improved fashion. The Rook's Nest might be the intended object of this reminiscence, but Forster's description veers off course. That said, recounting the railway journey enhances the author's imaginative reconnection with the site. He shifts from hesitancy to certainty by way of the railway line. The juvenile Forster developed a sense of space by asking for the names of the stations, kind of like, are we there yet? In a similar fashion, Forster in this passage plots his progress towards the house verbally along a narrative line. Each interim platform contributes to a sense of orientation within remembered space. Forster needs to transport himself to the house before describing it, and he personalises this journey, recapitulating the generic station, Welwyn, through his own juvenile mispronunciation. In a second attempt to describe the house, Forster deviates once again. He writes, I suppose I had better begin by a description of the house. It was 1 mile from Stevenage walking, and 1.5 driving, and was on a particular bad piece of road which led from Stevenage to Weston, a small village about 3 miles further on, and naturally had very little traffic. Stevenage is on the GNR, and is the highest point on the line between London and York, and the Rook's Nest is a good deal higher than Stevenage, so we had a very fine view to the west and northwest over Hertfordshire and part of Cambridgeshire. Again, Forster struggles to approach the object of his description, preoccupied this time with more varied modes of mobility. In an attempt to be thorough, he begins to fix the house between several coordinates on differing scales: Stevenage, Weston, York, Hertfordshire, Cambridgeshire. The result feels oddly imprecise though, because the house's proximity to each coordinate here is relative to the mode of transport taken. Each spatial referent moves the description further away from the house, branching beyond neighbouring towns and villages along the GNR tracks towards London and York, and upwards by virtue of Stevenage's altitude in the context of the line. Approaching this particular house becomes a challenge precisely because there are so many paths leading away from it. It's a very small node in a nationally vast network, and lacks this kind of centripetal pull of a major junction or terminus. Forster's third attempt at describing the house at Rook's Nest slips once again, and in a similar way. Quote, I don't know what to speak about first, but perhaps we'll tell about the house. The name was Rook's Nest, and the name Rook's Nest was not an ordinary name of a house, but the name of a hamlet. I think the 15-year-old Forster has difficulty beginning things, but the slippage also confirms the author's struggle to imaginatively approach the house without some kind of mediation. Named for the local hamlet, Rook's Nest is rather like a station. The name acts as a synecdoche for the village beyond, even though the resemblance between house and the broader locality might be rather limited. Before it's a house, then, the Rook's Nest features first and foremost in Forster's recollection as an important modal point, but a personal one. Physically, it's accessible by a connection between the railway and a particular bad piece of road, but imaginatively, Forster leads us on a much more circuitous route by a series of prolongations and deviations. By the time the narrative reaches it, the first physical description of the house strikes a slightly anticlimactic tone. Forster describes it initially as, it was very old. This feels at odds with the lively attention that he's paid to the site's physical plotting within railway and indeed road space. Before looking at the second example, I want to think a bit more carefully about the relationship between the motorcar and railway networks. Forster and Howard's End For Forster and Howard's End, the railway and motor car provide two vastly different modes of forging and breaking connections between characters and novel space. As with the Rook's Nest, Forster depicts the approach to the house at Howard's End with reference to both train and car. Indeed, he first acknowledges the gathering prominence of motor travel in 1910 from the vantage point of a moving train. And this is a journey taken by Mrs. Munt, who's related to the Schlegel, so the pro-railway family. The narrator describes how, along the railway, quote, at times the Great North Road accompanied her, more suggestive of infinity than any railway, awakening, after a nap of 100 years, to such a life as is conferred by the stench of motor cars, and to such a culture as is implied by the advertisements of anti-biliousness pills. These two infrastructures share a route for stretches of the journey, but not as equals. The road runs parallel to the rails, but it doesn't transport the narrative, which continues along with Mrs. Munt on the tracks. Car culture, Forster's narrator suggests, inflates and distorts and upsets the experience of those engaged in it through its association with that biliousness and stench. That striking admission that the Great North Road, which is quite ancient compared with the railway, was more suggestive of infinity than any railway, highlights just how far the imaginative associations of road and rail infrastructures had diverged during the 19th century steam age. Ruth Livesey has challenged this assumption that roads took a 100-year nap during this period, in her recent book Stagecoach Nation. For all the illuminating scholarship that exists on the changing effect of modernity with the coming of rail travel, she says, it is a mistake to trace this right back to the initial opening of passenger railways in Britain in the early 1830s. These roads persisted, the stagecoach roads persisted, and were put to practical and imaginary use throughout and beyond the 19th century. Much the same happens, I argue, with the railways during the first half of the 20th century, when road travel picked up pace. Railways persist throughout the 1900s, developing particularly during the interwar period into the Golden Age, but they lose the direct association with disaster and death that were made popular by Dickens's work in the preceding century, so their signification shifts during this period. To return to the motor car, those behind the wheel in Howard's End are anxious to get ahead. Forster depicts them as incapable of the profound sort of reflection that would help drivers form meaningful connections with the spaces they traverse. As the narrator concedes, the juggernaut driver, Henry Wilcox, quote, was always moving and causing others to move until the ends of the earth met. In the context of motoring, when to stop the journey and why is subject to individual rather than infrastructural determination, and drivers in Howard's End show little interest in pausing and taking stock. If the novel was structured according to the spatial logics associated with the speeding motion of the motor car and those who embrace it, it would limitlessly wander without meaningfully settling in one place. Like the perceived infinity of the Great North Road, the ends of the earth are not ends at all, but continuations. Capitalist ventures operated through increasingly global strands, and Henry Wilcox, who is very much a champion of capitalist development, and those who share his view on automobile travel look for ways around any structural impedance and any imperative that might cause them to pause and reflect. Let's return to Andrew Thacker's argument that the motor car is the key proponent in how Forster spatialises early 20th century. For him, Howard's End is, quote, attendant upon modernity, and the theme of the speeding motion of the motor car offers a significant image for comprehending the connections between these new geographies and modernity. Thacker suggests that these new geographies can only be accessed or understood through the innovation and the desire for flux favoured by the transitory Wilcox family. So reconfigured in the text, the motor car becomes a kind of interface, helping orient Edwardian characters in a shifting topography. But this isn't the only interface available to travellers in Howard's End. The railway and pedestrianism offer prominent alternatives, And I discovered last week Noor Dakak at Lancaster is currently pursuing the latter. She's looking at pedestrianism in Forster's work. So Forster doesn't present the railway and the motor car equally. He dissuades us from examining the automobile imaginary too closely through the narrator's cynicism towards car culture. For the most part, the various spaces proposed in the novel are always recounted from the Schlegel family perspective, none of whom embrace that car culture. It's a kind of biased lens. By its composition, then, the text filters any comprehension of, quotes, the connection that cars forge between what Thacker interprets as the topography of modernity and movement. It's filtered through substantial scepticism. That phrase, attendant upon modernity, is at odds, I think, with Forster's cast of motor car-loving characters who refuse to wait. The Wilcoxes seem eager to run alongside and outrun the modernising mobile world. It isn't always clear whether modernity for Thacker is a fixed topography or something a bit more mobile. Without clarifying this distinction, and without examining alternative established infrastructures that continue to shape imaginative mobility in the Edwardian age, Thacker partially accounts for how modern movement intersects with Forster's fiction. As Enda Duffy argues in the Speed Handbook, with speed came a new phase in the history of impatience. Only as speed became conventional could slowness become perceptible. For Duffy, this adjustment occurs in the early 20th century, coinciding with the emergence of motor cars that appear in Howard's End. Duffy's notion that impatience among travellers is a 20th century phenomenon strikes me as ever so slightly belated. It's at odds with the many anxious pauses in railway and stagecoach narratives from the previous century, not to mention forms of passenger travel through the ages, so like sea travel, pilgrimages, the kind of mass mobility that might come about as a result of war, for example. Nevertheless, Duffy reminds us of the compulsory waiting points built into rail travel, which stood out alongside an alternative system, conceived of in terms of self-directed acceleration and flux. But in Howard's End, waiting time isn't always met with impatience. Forster exploits the slowness associated with waiting at stations in order to attest to their persistent significance in this early 20th century narrative. Time spent waiting at the station becomes time to reflect, take stock, and to connect. Connections between new geographies depicted from positions of relative status are invested with a much more richly nuanced mobility than those encountered at high speed in Howard's End. So let's turn now to the second example, this time from the text itself. Before this novel becomes truly mobile, it pauses at King's Cross Station as the protagonist, Margaret Schlegel, quote, half sensibly, half poetically contemplates the significance of London's many railway termini. Margaret's reverie highlights an alternative approach to mobility in Howard's End, one incorporating both rapidity and flux and moments of anchoring stasis. Like Forster's account of the Rook's Nest, this passage highlights the roles that fixed markers play in accommodating moments of contemplation along the line. So there are gates to the glorious and the unknown. Through them we pass out into adventure and sunshine, and to them, alas, we return. There's much to pick up on in this very rich and surprisingly mobile quotation from the terminus. Margaret's strong feelings for termini are as slippery, I think, as Forster's recollections of the Rook's Nest. They reach beyond the station themselves and out towards the destinations of the railway lines associated with each of London's termini. Forster prepositions each of these remote places, Cornwall, Scotland, Wessex, the Fenlands, the illimitable Broads, in, down, through, or behind its respective station. Such prepositions, though brief, maintain a sense of physical connection between each terminus and its destination. This isn't a material, unmediated form of teleportation. A clear sense of direction accompanies each. Within the poised chaos of Waterloo, however, Forster stresses how figuratively unstable a station may become under the strain of even imaginatively connecting distant, disparate spaces. This has a slightly different dimension from the logistical chaos that Jerome associates with Waterloo in his farce Three Men in a Boat. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but he says, of course, nobody at Waterloo ever knows where a train is going to start from, or where the train is going to, or anything about it. In that story, they hijack a train and decide it's going where they want it to. Would recommend it. Though they appear fleetingly in Howard's End, London's termini work quite hard in the text. They store and articulate characteristics of remote and geographically diverse landscapes. They absorb travellers' ambitions for the journey ahead and frustrations on returning. Termini are so multifarious in their significance here that they suffer a kind of identity crisis. The emotions of fear and love that a Londoner might bestow on his stations are in keeping with the oscillation between distance and proximity that becomes almost frenetic at points in Margaret's mediation, between the freedom and return that stations equally facilitate. Margaret Schlegel's imaginatively roaming meditation on termini reverses what Alison Byerley has described as, quote, the central paradox of rail travel, the way in which one's body was able to outrun one's mental perception of place. As her thoughts on speed towards the opposite ends of the various railway lines leading out from London's termini, something wrong with the sentence. As her thoughts speed away from London, Margaret's mental perception of space accelerates far more rapidly than any train. Indeed, her thoughts move so swiftly that the linearity of the journey is condensed, packed into a single preposition. As a result, London's termini in this description become unstable, charged with latent potential energy. Byerley thinks of this dissonance between velocity of the mind and the velocity of the body in terms of virtual reality. But I think that in this instance, Michael Seo's efficient phrase, static turbulence, much more aptly describes the poised chaos of London's termini, as Miss Schlegel imagines them. That phrase, static turbulence, is similar in its oxymoronic composition to Byerley's virtual reality, but it emphasises the physical. This is important because railway lines anchor the direction of Margaret's mental movement here. The railway imaginary has its own infrastructure, and as the motorcar's prominence develops in the early 20th century, the groundedness of railway lines becomes much more pronounced. Echoing Mrs. Munt's earlier reflections on the Great North Road, Forster goes on to note that for Margaret, King's Cross had always suggested infinity. To Margaret, I hope that it will not set the reader against her. The station of King's Cross had always suggested infinity. Its very situation, withdrawn a little from the facile splendours of St. Pancras, implied a comment on the materialism of life. Those two great arches, colourless and different, shouldering between them an unlovely clock, were fit portals for some eternal adventure, whose issue might be prosperous, but would certainly not be expressed in the ordinary language of prosperity. It's kind of flight of fancy here. I think infinity in this instance registers very differently from the uneven infinity of the Great North Road. Situated between the two great arches and the unlovely clock, Forster reconfigures the infinite to resonate from a temporally clear and geographically precise location. Through its rootedness, the infinity proposed at King's Cross is less hasty than that associated with the road, encompassing time for the imaginative escape that Margaret rehearses as she approaches the station in this scene. For the poetically minded Margaret, King's Cross Station is an infinitely enduring portal for an eternal adventure, whose potency lies in its endurance and its mobility. But Margaret's imaginative flight from the metropolis comes with a caveat. The unwelcome promise of a return journey curtails the liberating escapism of this reverie before it really manages to move. To them, alas, we return. Within the return ticket, there is a threat of the end of an illusion, as Michel de Certeau describes the terminus as the end of the illusion. Unless explicitly mentioned, all tickets for travel via London's termini purchased in Howard's End are assumed to be returns. Even Margaret's vivid imagination cannot shake off the overarching commercial structures and established patterns of movement that tacitly direct passengers on the railway. What remains between infinity and the closure of a return journey in these termini is a narrative space that is notoriously tricky to meaningfully unpack, in spite of the linear simplicity of the tracks themselves. Poised precariously between these poles of rural and urban space, stasis and rapid movement then, there's a risk of things falling into the substantial imaginative gap between the commencement of a journey and its return to the same point. In an expanded version of this, I discuss this with reference to Mrs. Wilcox, who falls out of the narrative promptly after travelling through King's Cross. Rapid mental movement along fixed lines, so salient in this contemplation of London's termini, becomes integral to other localities encountered in Howard's End. So Howard's End moves between a selection of set points and junctions, between the Schlegel sisters' London residence and the Wilcoxes' portfolio of houses scattered across the south of England. Reference is made to continental travel, but Forster strictly situates the narrative itself in places that can be accessed by rail. While Forster exhibits multiple instances of mental movement throughout Howard's End, often off the tracks, they're always in context tacitly associated with railway infrastructure. Judith Hertz describes attention to being in place as a particularly Forsterian quirk in her reading of Forster's language. She highlights the author's tendency to convey significant character traits through that character's interaction with space. On the Schlegel sisters, for example, Hertz notes how the very geography, estuaries, north winds, changes of soil, of coast, maps the contradictions of the sisters' unmatching words. It is this embedding of a moment in a larger space and time, letting conversation sometimes absorb, at other times clash with the narrator's voiceover, that makes reading a Forster novel similar to reading a poem. I agree with Hertz that the shifting topographies that permeate Forster's prose have this kind of poetic quality, but I want to think more carefully about how exactly the narrative traverses these. For Hertz, Forster's mobile and far-ranging language conflates a range of disparate spaces that can't logistically be resolved, resulting in a significantly weighted sense of simultaneity. But Forster's poetic habit of embedding a moment in a larger space and time might equally be read as an instance of the kind of static turbulence associated with railway travel. Without recoupling the geography of Forster's sentences with railway infrastructure that delineates the Schlegel sisters' mental movement from those elsewhere in Howard's End, Hertz's analysis can only go so far here. So, in my final example, I'm going to revisit the passage in Howard's End that Hertz examines in her analysis, with Margaret's meditation on London's termini in mind. Forster writes, "If one wanted to show a foreigner England, perhaps the wisest course would be to take him to the final section of the Purbeck Hills and stand him on their summit, a few miles to the east of Corfe. Then system after system of our island would roll together from under his feet. Nor is suburbia absent. Bournemouth's ignoble coast cowers to the right, heralding the pine trees that mean, for all their beauty, red houses and the Stock Exchange, and extend to the gates of London itself. So tremendous is the city's trail." The best vantage point for understanding England is actually very like a rural terminus, the final section of the Purbeck Hills. From here, a foreign traveller, reminiscent of the Italians travelling through Berlin's Bahnhof d'Italia, can follow a visual chain that once merged conveys the presence of an entire country. Like the railway, this radial perspective tugs insistently towards London. Indeed, the rapid mental movement towards the metropolis that concludes the passage runs back along an imagined line during Margaret's earlier contemplation of London's termini, so it makes a kind of return journey here. Though the Purbeck Hills summit might be relatively remote, it is nevertheless accessible by rail. It is nevertheless accessible by rail, a few miles to the east of Corfe. Forster helpfully advises us near a station on the Swanage line. Systematised, the rolling countryside becomes rolling stock, imaginatively transporting the sightseer an impossible distance from the various limits or ends of the lines suggested by the multifaceted scenery. This subtly draws attention to the trade connection between Bournemouth and the London Stock Exchange, a connection that was facilitated by the railway's transportation of international freight moving from the coastal town to the country beyond. So Hertz rightly establishes this passage as evidence of the embedding of moment in a larger space and time, but Forster partly derives this poetics from railway infrastructure, one that could connect physically with mismatched physical features of the landscape with a linear set of tracks. I agree with Hertz's conclusion that Forster's sentences merge intimacy and distance, but this process has a strange kind of delineated tug against that merging. It's a bit more careful than that, I think. It's grounded in railway logic, rather than the freewheeling of the motor car or the free roaming of pedestrian movement. Margaret's mental movement from a fixed terminus contrasts starkly with the unsatisfying perspectives afforded by motor travel. From the moving vehicle, Forster famously describes how, for Margaret Schlegel, the scenery heaved and merged like porridge. Automobile motion distorts coherent observation, leaving Margaret with no clear sense of orientation, no clear sense of space. Any geographies exposed en route in the motor car remain nonsensical to the Schlegels as travellers, and since the narrative tends to filter through their perspective, this landscape isn't brought into focus in Howard's End. So repeated and return journeys reiterate and strengthen the railway framework, latently underpinning movement within Howard's End. Forster tends to punctuate episodes set in each of the major locations, Howard's End, Oniton and Swanage, with returns to London. For example, at no point does the narrative travel directly between Howard's End and Oniton, in spite of spending significant amounts of time in those two places. But several journeys between these destinations in London do receive considerable narrative attention. And though various characters, the Schlegel sisters, the Wilcoxes, and lower-class Basts, tend to move independently around this text, their journeys nevertheless follow the same or very, very similar narrative lines. The paths run parallel, overlap, and merge. The circuit of common routes is already long established from the novel's outset. For example, Mr. Wilcox's affair with one of the Schlegel sisters' acquaintances, Jackie Bast, takes place many years before the narrative even begins, so it's been running this way for decades. The coincidence, while stretching suspended disbelief, does fit well with the text's restricted itinerary of routes through England. And I think this is an itinerary that kind of speaks back to railway novels from the 19th century. Even the most car-cultured family presented in this text continues to move along established railway lines then. While Forster makes space for sensory aspects of automobile travel in Howard's End, this has limited impact on how characters move between different population centres within the narrative and the structure of the text as a whole. The transition does not provide access to new space beyond the limits of the railway network, nor does it expose new routes between existing spaces. The Great North Road might suggest infinity, but the text does not move along it, so we never get to explore what that infinity might mean. Through its movement between a handful of fixed localities and its inevitable return to Howard's End, this novel exemplifies then how the railway's structural influence endured, permeating characters' movements within narratives, and by extension, narrative form itself, even when rail travel's functional significance was at risk of receding. Like the epigraph, only connect, the house at Howard's End is also presented with peculiarly terminal qualities, particularly in its paradoxical fixity and mobility. Forster conflates conceptions of ending in terms of narrative form and content. It's inevitable that the narrative will terminate at Howard's End. Domestic space and railway infrastructure share similar qualities in Howard's End and begin to merge. And Forster's use of terminality and railway logistics exemplifies what 80 years of railway infrastructure, real or imagined, can contribute to fictional mobility. And this is important, I think, given the emphasis that this novel places elsewhere on how mobility shapes the way that we live.